Hello and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. My name is Laura. I'm super excited for today's video because not only is it my first video of 2024, Happy New Year, I'm drinking a glass of mimosa this morning as I'm filming this reading recap for 2023 video for you. 2023 was my first year getting back into reading. I had a goal of reading 23 books in 2023 and I am super happy to say that I well surpassed that goal. I read 42 books in 2023. I'm going to start the video by going through some of my stats, the ones that I kind of find the most interesting, and then I'm going to go through every book that I read and tell you the title, the author, and the rating that I gave it. I'm going to pause for all of the 5-star books and give you a little bit more about why I thought that they were 5 stars. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's go with my Goodreads stats first because I thought that those were kind of fun and interesting. My first year using Goodreads as well, so that was kind of a fun experience. So like I said, I read 42 books this year, and that was a total of 15,599 pages. My shortest book that I read was How to Keep House While Drowning, and that was 156 pages. And then Little Women was 777 pages. Isn't that like a satisfying number? It was a chunky book, but worth it. That's one spoiler alert that we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about here in a minute. So the average book length was 371 pages. The book that I read that was most shelved by others was Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. And the book that was least shelved by other people was Islands at the End of the World for Austin Aslan. I read that one because the Bright Side Girl, Macy, here on YouTube, she does these readathons that are super fun. I might participate in a couple of hers this year as well. She does like a mermaidathon, and so one of the reading challenges for that was to read, you know, obviously books about like islands and mermaids and all the fun like summertime reads. My average rating for 2023 was 4.2 stars, which I thought was pretty high. I did have a really good reading year, but I will also give a little caveat as to why that's so high here in a second. The highest rated book that I read on Goodreads was a 4.57 average, and that was Finding Me by Viola Davis. Okay, so those are kind of like the interesting ones from Goodreads that I found. Then I made some spreadsheets to come up with some additional stats. The first one being the overall ratings for all the books that I read this year. You can see that I only gave 1 star, or 2% of the books that I read was a 1-star rating, and there's a reason for that I'll get into in just a second. 29% were 4 stars and 21% were 4.5 stars, which means that like exactly half of the books that I read were 4 or 4.5 stars, which I'm pretty happy with. And then 19% of the books that I read were 5 stars. And then kind of like the mid-range, 3.5 books took up about 28% total with those combined. The reason though that I will say that I only had one 1-star book and then nothing else below a 3 for the rest of the year is because I DNF'd a lot of books this year. That wasn't a stat that I kept track of. This year I will be keeping track of any books that I DNF. I would say I DNF'd at least a dozen books this year. Anyway, I'll be keeping track of that, but that's one reason that my ratings I think were a little bit on the higher side. And then the next stat that I made was the different genres that I read from. The only thing I didn't differentiate with the genres was adult versus YA, but I think most of the books that I read this year were in the adult category. But the highest genre that I read from this year was mystery thriller. I read 8 books in that category, and then romance and historical fiction were tied for second with 6 books in each of those genres. I read 4 books from the categories of literary fiction, classics, and fantasy. I read 3 memoirs, 2 horror, 2 science fiction, and then 1 biography and 1 nonfiction. I'm pretty happy about the overall like spread of the different genres. I really do enjoy like genre hopping and like kind of getting a good blend, and I'm very much a mood reader, so I might be in the mood for like a mystery thriller or a horror 1 minute and then want something a little bit more light and fluffy and switch to a romance the next. So I switch it up quite often, and I think that does show with this stat. Before we start going over all the books that I did finish this year, I wanted to get into just a few superlatives. My first being my best and worst. The lowest rated book was that single 1 star of the year, and that was Verity by Colleen Hoover. That book just did not do it for me at all. I found the first person narrative to be really repetitive. I just think that there are so many like mystery thrillers or romances out there that are just a lot better written than Colleen Hoover's writing style. It just wasn't for me. I could see that there would be an audience for it, but that was my worst book of the year. My best book of the year was such a surprise to me. It was The Crossover by Kwame Alexander, and this is like so not up my alley. I opened it up and I was like, oh, poetry. I'm not a big poetry person. I never was. My bachelor's degree is in English and I hated poetry, you guys. It is like the most accessible poetry I've ever read in my life. Of course, it's, you know, geared towards like middle grade children, so there's that, but it was just so well done. And when I tell you that that book wrecked me, like I was ugly crying, and I'm not really a crier, especially when it comes to reading books. In fact, there's only 2 books that I read this year. We'll get into that when we get to the 5-star rating piece of this, but The Crossover was one that I cried not only the first time I read it this year, but I cried the second time I read it too, because I read it first just for myself to test the waters, so to speak, and then I read it to my 7-year-old daughter as well, and she really loved listening to it too. It's a beautiful book, you guys, so don't let the poetry or the middle grade classification scare you away. Don't even let it scare away if you don't like basketball, okay? I like sports, but you know, I'm not like a huge basketball fan or anything, and it blew me away. Favorite book of the year by far. The biggest disappointment to me was one that I DNF'd, and that was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. She's a beautiful writer, you guys, and I fully expected to absolutely love this. I went into this with 5-star expectations based on some of the reviews and ways that I've heard other people talk about it. I thought it was totally going to be a book for me. And the imagery of the actual circus was beautiful. I will give it that. And sometimes like that's enough for me, but I just found the plot to be really, really boring and slow. Like I just didn't get it. I didn't feel really connected to the characters. I tried. I gave that book like a good 200 pages, I think, before I finally just said, I can't finish it. I don't know, maybe someday if I'm in the mood for just like a very slow paced, slow burn type of book with that beautiful circus imagery. I love circuses, and like the concept of the book sounded amazing. You know, these 2 characters that are kind of like almost like a star-crossed lovers is what I thought it was going to be. Like, you know, they were destined to be enemies and like, you know, competitors, and that they were going to have this romance that, I mean, like I said, I went 200 pages and like the romance wasn't there. There was really not much of anything happening. I think that's all the superlatives. Now let's go ahead and get into all 42 books that I read, and I'll tell you the rating that I gave each of them. And I'm going to go over these in the order that I read them for the year. The first book that I finished in 2023 was The Nothing Man by Catherine Ryan Howard. I gave that 3.5 stars. Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, I gave 4.5 stars. This Tender Land by William Kent Kruger, I gave 4.5 stars. Local Missing Woman by Mary Kubica, I gave 3 stars. Verity by Colleen Hoover, I gave 1 star. In February, I finished Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, and that was my first 5-star rating of the year. I finished it on Valentine's Day. Just what a heartwarming tale. If you want a book that is just majorly focused on character development, it is like a more slow burning plot. I guess I didn't enjoy that in The Night Circus, but it worked for me in The Little Women. I just felt really connected to the characters, was what drove me to love this book. And I do find that I kind of tend to enjoy books that have really good character development. Not only did I love The Little Women and I loved Lori, but I loved their mother. There were moments where the mom was like low-key, really frustrated, had really had it with certain situations, and like there was a part where she like got a letter and she like rips it up and throws it in the fireplace, and it's like, ooh, mama has some fire inside of her. And I just really loved her character. She was like such a side character, but she was one of my favorites, honestly. Of course, I loved Jo. I loved all of the characters. This book did make me cry, so this was the other book, only 2 books out of the year, that made me shed some tears. And this one wasn't like ugly crying, but I did shed some tears. I won't spoil it in case you somehow have never either read or seen the movie. I also watched like the 1990s movie adaptation, which I really enjoyed as well. One thing that you will notice if you read Little Women is that each chapter seems very like kind of separated, and it almost reads as if each chapter is like its own little short story. But that's how the book was first published, as just like these little short stories that were later put together to be this novel. So it makes sense if you know the history of the book. It didn't take away from any of my reading, you know, experience or entertainment. I just really love this book. Next, I read The Winter of Our Discontent by John Steinbeck, which I gave a 4-star. I read A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. This was a 4-star for me. Take My Hand by Dolan Perkins Valdez was my next 5-star read of the year, and this book is a historical fiction. It takes place in the 60s or 70s, like way more recently than it should have been, honestly. Yeah, Montgomery, Alabama in 1973. So this is a historical fiction about a family planning clinic in Montgomery that was doing things that they had no business doing to young children as far as the family planning goes. Again, I don't want to do any spoilers or anything in this reading wrap up, but Sybil Townsend is the main character, and I just love, you know, kind of her character development. I loved the 2 little girls that she was working with too, Erica and India. I think that I kind of really resonated with this, being somebody that works for the state government. You know, you can see how Sybil Townsend, like she's, you know, new and fresh out of college and ready to make a difference in the world, and she wants to believe that the work that she's doing for this family planning clinic is making a difference, right? Like that's what the government and the clinic is like putting out there for the public, and she herself initially believes it until something so devastating happens that should have never happened to one of these little girls. And then that's where, you know, it's like, okay, this is no more a gray area anymore, and so she becomes a whistleblower on the things that are happening. It was just a really well written story. I loved getting the perspective of, you know, Erica and India and her family as a family like receiving government supports. It had a lot of things to say and make you think about when it comes to like, where is the line that we draw as, you know, the government trying to help people versus, you know, being too hands-on in their decision making. So anyway, very good book. Next, I read The Diamond Eye by Kate Quinn, which was 4.5 stars. Book Lovers by Emily Henry, that was a 4-star. Next, I read Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak, which I gave 3.5 stars. I'm not positive I'm saying his last name correctly. I think at first I had this as a 4-star, and then I did some reflecting, you know, at the end of the year, going through all of these, and there were a couple that I changed up, which I think his was one of them, if I remember correctly. I think it's more like a 3.5 star. I did really like the ending of that one though. Next, I read Wild: From Lost to Found on the Pacific Crest Trail by Cheryl Strayed. This was another 5-star read for me. April was a really good reading month for me because there are 3 5-stars that we're about to get to in a row. So Wild is a memoir by Cheryl Strayed. I saw a lot of criticism for Wild on Goodreads and some of the reviews, and I can kind of understand it if you go into that book thinking that, one, it's going to be like informational on helping you prepare yourself for hiking the PCT. It's not that. Or just people who honestly seemed really judgy towards Cheryl Strayed and the decisions that she made, but I don't think that there's any need to be, because she makes it very clear throughout the book that, you know, she is on this journey hiking the Pacific Crest Trail by herself because she knows that she has made some poor decisions in her life, and it's just kind of like that you're at the end of the rope, midlife crisis, whatever you want to call it. You know, she just was at that place in her life where she felt like she had nothing left to lose, and so she just wanted to go on this adventure by herself. And like the title suggests, like, she kind of finds herself at the end. What I really loved about the way this memoir was written, though, was that, like, one moment you would be on the PCT in that timeline with Cheryl, and then she would see like a particular flower on the trail, and it would remind her of, you know, something from her past, like a moment with her mother or with her ex-husband or something like that, and you're all of a sudden transported into like that flashback. Just get a lot of like really good character development. I know that's weird to say for like a memoir. She's not a character, she's a real person, and this was her real life experience, but I just really like the way that the book was put together. If you want a memoir that reads a lot like a really good fiction novel, I think this would be a good one to recommend. Next was Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. I mean, 5 stars for sure. I listened to this one on audiobook, and I enjoyed the narrator as well. He did a great job of like making different characters' voices very distinct. It was really enjoyable to listen to. 10 out of 10 Agatha Christie ending. I just really like her. I've read a few of hers in the past, but it had been a really long time since I had read one of her novels, and I just really enjoyed that one. Next was Finding Me by Viola Davis, also a 5 star, also one that I listened to on audiobook, which I highly recommend. She won a Grammy for this audiobook performance for a reason. She's just, there's nothing like listening to her tell her story, you know, her tragic childhood and some of like the triumphs and tribulations and things that she went through without, you know, throughout her life, and how she got to where she is now. Just listening to that from her own voice, it's just beautiful. Perfection. I love that memoir so much. If I was going to give a superlative for best audiobook that I listened to this year, it would be Finding Me for sure. Next, I read Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt, and I gave this one a 4 star. Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West by Gregory Maguire, also a 4 star. How to Keep House While Drowning, A Gentle Approach to Cleaning and Organizing by K.C. Davis. I gave that one a 4 star. Next was The Crossover by Kwame Alexander. Need I say more? 5 stars. Easy to read, accessible type of way. You could easily finish this book in just a couple hours. Please pick it up. Read it. If you have kids, read it to them, especially if they're, I would say, you know, my 7-year-old daughter loved it. I think the target audience is probably more like 10 to 13, kind of like that middle school age. That's the age of the 2 boys that are the main characters in this book. It's about brotherhood and family and just the importance of that. And it's about growing up and changes in life, you know, changing us for better or for worse. And just, it was very deeply, emotionally hard-hitting for me. Loved it. 5 stars. The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave was a 3 star for me. The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury was a 4 star. The Martian by Andy Weir, which I read next, so why I read 2 Martian books right back to back, I don't know. But The Martian by Andy Weir was a 5 star for me. In the same way that Kwame Alexander's poetry is very accessible for someone who doesn't like poetry, I think Andy Weir and The Martian is a very accessible science fiction. He's clearly a very intelligent scientist, Andy Weir, but he writes in a way that anybody can pick up this book. You know, science was by far not my best subject. I majored in English for a reason, because it was like the furthest from math and science as you could get as far as a major in college goes, but I just really enjoyed this book. I liked the mixed media pieces of like the journal entry If you've never heard of The Martian, I feel like a lot of people have at this point, but if you haven't, it's a science fiction novel about this, crew who land on Mars and things go wrong and somebody ends up getting left behind, and it's just a story about him trying to survive. It was just a really well-written story. I loved it, and then I also watched the movie of this one. You'll find that I do that a lot, like reading the book and then watching the movie or the TV series that the book is based on, and I loved the movie as well. They took out quite a big of a chunk towards the end, obviously for the sake of time for the movie, but it was a really good adaptation, and I enjoyed both of those. Next was The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, and I rated that 4 stars. Homebodies by Tembe Denton Hurst. This was a debut novel, and I gave it a 3 star. Yellowface by R.F. Kuang was 4.5 stars. Skin of the Sea by Natasha Bowen was 3.5 stars. All of these books you're going to hear me talk about next, like these next, 4 books or so, are going to be from that Mermaid Readathon. So you're going to see a theme here, and this was all during the month of July. Beach Town by Mary Kay Andrews was a 3 star. I listened to that one on audiobook. The Islands at the End of the World by Austin Aslan was a 4.5 star. And The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea by Maggie Tokuda Hall was a 3.5 star. Office BFFs, The Tale of Office from Two Best Friends Who Were There by Jenna Fisher and Angela Kinsey that was a 4-star rating for me. Really cute. I also listened to that one on audiobook, which is what I would recommend. The Housemaid by Frida McFadden was a 3 star for me. Beach Read by Emily Henry was a 3.5. Fairy Tale by Stephen King was a 4.5 star. The Great Alone by Kristen Hanna was also a 4.5 star. Booked by Kwame Alexander. This is another book in the crossover series. This one is about soccer, again with the family dynamics. This one was a 4 star for me. It didn't affect me quite as emotionally as the crossover did. How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. This, it was like a toss-up kind of between the crossover, The Martian, How to Sell a Haunted House. Those were all considered, to be what I would consider my best book. Those would probably be my top 3 of the year. So How to Sell a Haunted House, this was my first time reading from Grady Hendrix, and I'm super excited to read more from him. This was not a super highly rated book over on Goodreads, which just goes to show that, don't let the ratings steer you away. Just because a rating is not super high on Goodreads doesn't mean that you're not personally going to enjoy it. How to Sell a Haunted House is about 2 adult siblings, a brother and a sister, who have both recently experienced the loss of their parents, unexpectedly, very tragic loss. It's at first about grief, and then quickly becomes a book about, money and family inheritance and some of the trouble that can cause within the family dynamics. So there's, some of them arguing back and forth about what to do with that. And then come the horror elements of, creepy dolls and puppets and imaginary monsters that can actually attack you. The horror elements literally made me laugh out loud at times. It's very campy type of horror, which I actually really enjoyed. There's so much more underneath of it, because underneath there's a layer that talks a lot about generational trauma, right? And what happens when the parents, or at least one of the parents, have this traumatic childhood experience that plays a lot into the way that you end up bringing up your children, and you kind of pass that trauma, so to speak, down to your own children and then your children's children. You can kind of see that cycle being repeated, and just the fact that that's what happens whenever you have that kind of generational trauma that doesn't get dealt with properly. And the ending was 10 out of 10 for me. At times these were very unlikable characters, but I think by the end, if you read it the same way that I did, at least, I really enjoyed the ending of this. So definitely a 5-star read for me, and one of my favorites of the year for sure. Next was Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone by Benjamin Stevenson. I listened to this on audiobook and I gave it a 3.5 star. Billy Summers by Stephen King was a 4 star. Christmas Shopaholic by Sophie Kinsella. I just picked this up on a whim because I used to really love Sophie Kinsella back when I was like in my early 20s, and it was like such a good like nostalgic read, so I think that's why I kind of rated it more highly. Like, it was just a cute little story. 4 stars. Next was Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. I gave that 4.5 stars. And The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles, which I also gave 4.5 stars. And then last that I listened to on audiobook was Faking Christmas by Cindy Steele, which I gave a 3-star rating to. My kids and my husband just got home, so it's about to get loud in here. That is it for this 2023 reading wrap up. I hope that you guys learned a little bit more about my preferences and maybe found some things that you can relate to in this video, or maybe some things that, you know, you haven't heard of before that you would be willing to pick up and give it a try. I always think it's fun to listen to somebody's perspective on a book, even if it's something that like we rated them completely opposite and had opposite reading experiences with them. I think that's totally fun, and that's what makes BookTube so great, is everybody has their own opinions about the books that they read. So I can't wait for another wonderful year of reading in 2024. I wish you a great year of reading too. I have a goal of reading 50 books this year. That's almost 1 book a week. I think it's pretty doable for me. So we'll see. Fingers crossed I can meet that, or maybe even exceed it like I exceeded my goal from 2023. So thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I will see you again in the next one. Bye-bye.